When we picture Native American history in the 1700s, the image is often one of unified resistance against European expansion, continent neatly divided between indigenous nations and colonial empires. But that image, as powerful as it is, oversimplifies a far more complex and dynamic reality. Long before the United States expanded westward, even before British control was solidified, a fierce struggle for dominance was already unfolding across the interior of North America. This was not a simple war between Europeans and indigenous nations. It was a war within indigenous worlds, a brutal contest for trade routes, territory, and survival between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, two powerful confederacies navigating a rapidly changing world. To understand this conflict, we start with the Haudenosaunee, known to Europeans as the Iroquois Confederacy, composed of 5, and later 6, nations bound by the Great Law of Peace. The Confederacy was a diplomatic and military powerhouse. By the late 1600s, they had expanded their influence through the Beaver Wars, driven by the insatiable European demand for beaver pelts. European traders introduced firearms, and suddenly, access to muskets became synonymous with survival. The Haudenosaunee leveraged alliances with the English and Dutch to secure weapons and dominate trade along the Great Lakes. But to the north and west, another force was rising, the Anishinaabe. This group, including the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, was just as adaptive. They established their own trade relationships with French merchants, gaining firearms and positioning themselves as crucial intermediaries in the vast trade networks stretching deep into the continent. This wasn't just commerce, it was geopolitics. As European empires competed, indigenous nations maneuvered strategically, choosing alliances that best served their own security and autonomy. But these alliances were fragile. Trade routes overlapped, hunting territories shrank as beaver populations declined, and the balance of power began to shift. By the early 1700s, tensions between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe exploded into open conflict. It was about who would control the interior, who would dictate access to European goods, and who would mediate diplomacy between rival empires. The Great Lakes became a contested zone. Raids intensified. War parties moved along waterways that served as highways for both trade and conflict. Communities were displaced, villages were burned, and captives were taken. This was not a unified indigenous front. It was a shifting landscape of strategic calculations. The Haudenosaunee fought to preserve their dominance, while the Anishinaabe sought to break it and expand their own influence westward. The fur trade amplified every single tension. European demand didn't just connect indigenous nations to global markets. It fundamentally altered their internal dynamics. Clans debated policy. Leaders weighed the risks of war. Young warriors sought prestige through battle. Some Haudenosaunee factions favored closer ties with the British. Others sought neutrality. Among the Anishinaabe, similar debates unfolded over their French partnerships. These were sovereign nations making complex choices in a world transforming under their feet. By the mid-1700s, the balance began to tilt. The Anishinaabe expanded westward, consolidating power around Lake Superior and Lake Michigan. The Haudenosaunee, now facing pressure from both indigenous rivals and encroaching British settlers, saw their influence shrink. Then came a seismic shift, the French and Indian War. Indigenous nations were once again drawn into an imperial conflict, but the internal contest between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe had already redrawn the map of the interior. When Britain emerged victorious in 1763, it didn't step into a vacuum. It stepped into a landscape forged by decades of indigenous competition and diplomacy. This matters because the myth of a single, unified indigenous resistance erases the sovereignty and agency of these nations. It implies they were passive victims. The reality is that Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe leaders were architects of their own destinies. This forgotten civil war was a struggle born from global economic integration. European markets influenced hunting patterns in the Great Lakes. Firearms altered military strategy. The interior of North America became a chessboard long before American independence. When the United States began its westward expansion, the geopolitical groundwork had already been laid. Some nations entered treaties from positions weakened by these earlier conflicts. Others leveraged newly consolidated power. Today, when we look at a map of the Midwest, we see state lines. But beneath those borders lies an older map, one shaped by canoe routes, trade alliances, and intertribal warfare. The struggle between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe reminds us that history is never a simple story. It is layered, contested, and driven by ambition, survival, and adaptation. The interior of North America was not passively claimed. It was fought over, fiercely, by indigenous powers locked in a contest that reshaped the continent from the inside out. In dismantling the myth of monolithic unity, we find a much more powerful story of sovereignty, strategy, and nations navigating a new world on their own terms.